just want to say a few words about our guests and also, since I'm the historian and curator here at the museum, just a few things that the museum can offer by way of helping you with your research or ways in which we overlap and intersect with one another. So firstly, and probably most importantly for all of you, our book buyer, Craig Servillo, is the guy over there. So he's the guy that you want to be buying lunch, treating very well, etc. Points of contact, myself and Mark Stout, who used to have my job a few years ago. We have over 660 podcasts. There's transcripts available for many of them. Quite a few of them are unique, one of a kind. We have FSB defectors, Robert Gates, a former head of India's research and analysis wing, so all kinds of stuff on there. We have probably over 1,000 programs, again, many of them unique or one of a kind. Our collection, it's not available digitally online, but we have over 10,000 artifacts spanning almost every era and every continent. We also have ongoing programs and outputs like exhibitions. We're developing a new temporary exhibition, and we have pop-ups and online exhibitions coming, looking at the war in Ukraine and also the story of open source intelligence and the war in Ukraine. Okay, let's get over to our really awesome panel. So I'm just going to say a few words about them, then I'm going to take a seat and we're going to begin the conversation. Okay, so first off, in reverse order, is my friend Nick Reynolds, who's a standing rebuke to the idea that you can be humble, kind and humane, and that you cannot be humble, kind and humane and very, very distinguished. So, PhD from Oxford, Marine Corps officer, CIA officer and historian, New York Times best-selling author. Oh, it just never ends with you, does it? His most recent book is Need to Know, World War II and the Rise of American Intelligence, which is excellent. Next, Alexander Rose is the author of 6 books, and he's working on a 7th on the story of how the US Navy captured the German U-boat U-505. And if anyone gets themselves over to Chicago, you can see the entire thing in the Museum of Science and Industry, and it's pretty amazing. He's also very well known for writing Washington Spies, which is the book that was used as the basis for the TV show Turn on the Culper spy ring. Now, if you haven't managed to see the George Washington letter we have here at the museum, I would encourage you to do so. The museum closes at 7 today, and it's on the 4th floor. So this is the letter that Washington wrote to Nathaniel Sackett to set up America's first civilian espionage network. Next, Ellen Nakashima. She covers intelligence and national security for the Washington Post. She's the co-author of The Prince of Tennessee, The Rise of Al Gore. Wow, Al Gore seems like a land ago, a long time ago in a valley far away. And then on Amazon, when you click on your name, Ellen Nakashima, another book comes up, Thermodynamic Optimization of Industrial Energy Systems. I'm just checking, is that also you? No, I didn't think so. Okay. Ellen's been part of 3 Pulitzer Prize winning teams. And last year, she was invited to a state dinner at the White House. Wondering if that's going to happen again anytime soon, but yeah. Moving on to Douglas London, author of The Recruiter, Spying and the Lost Art of American Intelligence. This book is based on Douglas's 34-year career with the CIA as a case officer. The story of how you recruit an agent named Bilal has stuck with me to this day, so I very much enjoyed speaking to you for our podcast, Doug, Spycast the other year. One review states that on finishing The Recruiter, you cannot help but feel that you have been recruited in a way. you clearly haven't lost the knack of recruiting since you left the CIA, I think. And he's had a number of awards, been the Chief of Station several times, and was awarded the CIA's Career Intelligence Medal, amongst other citations. Well, since we have a veritable feast of talent, let's dine. Okay. So I think the very first question, what was it like when you held the first copy of your first book? Take us to that tactile, emotional moment when you held it in your hands and you're like, wow, I'm an author. If we could start with you, Nick.
So my first book was my PhD thesis. My first book was my PhD thesis, which was about the German resistance to Hitler in World War II. And the book was didn't make a really big splash in the English-speaking world. It was published in London, and it got decent reviews. But the real excitement was after it got published in Germany. It was reviewed above the fold in major German newspapers, and the visceral moment that I think of when I think of that book was a review that I got from a German veterans organization. So this is in the 70s. So these guys are World War II vets, and it was a little tiny review, and it said, "It is just amazing that an Anglo-Saxon could have written this book and understand how a German soldier feels." So that was my visceral moment.
Alexander?
Thanks. Well, I'm probably a little odd in that I'm completely unemotional about it. By the time the book actually comes out in print and you're holding the thing, I've already moved on to the next book. I tend to just pick it up and go, oh, okay, right, great.
Even for the first one?
Yeah. Oh, it was a disaster. So there was no tactile experience with that. It was, oh, thank God that's over. Next. But I tend to just forget. I can almost forget what I just wrote because you're moving into a completely different subject. So I did a book a couple of years ago called The Land of the Fox, which is stocked in the bookstore downstairs. And I couldn't. By the end of it, I couldn't even remember, the names of the two hero or the two characters I'd been using in this thing. I was going, what are their names? It's like I had some sort of memory problem. But yeah, so I'm a little odd that way, I think. So I'm going to hand that over to someone who can provide a better experience of this.
Well, is this on? As you noted, I am actually not an author or historian or author of espionage and intelligence history. The one book I did co-author, called The Prince of Tennessee, came out in the summer of 2000, written primarily by my great colleague and mentor, David Marinis, and promptly 3 or 4 months later was hit on the remainder pile. So that was my one experience with co-authoring a book. Hopefully I'll actually get to write one of my own one day.
Well, I'm kind of the slacker on this panel of writing, but for me it was more of a uh-oh moment than a whoa moment because, I'd spent my whole adult life, 34 years, undercover. So to see a book that had the big CIA seal in my name, my initial reaction is, maybe I should hide this somewhere. But so that was more for me the issue of just sort of being out there as a public person as opposed to trying to be out of the public eye for so many years.
Mm-hmm. What made each of you want to write the book that you wrote? I've heard some people describe it as a sickness that they carried around in their stomach, and for other people it was a beautiful dove that had to emanate and fly off into heaven. What was it like for each of you?
So there's a long shaggy dog story. My dad got me a job in a bank in my junior year of college, and I just hated it. You had to show up on time. You had to dress in a certain way. your lunch was exactly 30 minutes. And I said, I am going to do everything I can not to have this kind of existence. And so I came up with the idea of researching the German resistance to Hitler. My dad was a diplomat stationed in Berlin, and he knew some of these guys, and they would come around to the house. And I thought, well, why don't I see how far this will go and start interviewing them? And I was amazed that they would talk to a 20-year-old pipsqueak, but they did, and so that blossomed into my book eventually. So did it write itself? I mean, it was just always there. You know, I would do something else, and then it would kind of call me back. So it was a kind of calling.
Again, I'm gonna. I write for a cause that I think is near and dear to all of our hearts, and I refer, of course, to money. I just tend to put words together for cash.
It's as good a reason as any.
It's an extremely good reason, and so I don't really have any. I was sort of brought up. I mean, I was a journalist, a journalist of sorts. I was on the editorial board, so I wrote bits that nobody read for several years, and so I was always taught to think of writing almost like a journeyman. It's like a trade, rather than a calling or even an art in some ways. But I just like writing. I find it interesting to put these things together, and you make the puzzle work, and you put all the pieces in there. So so that's essentially how I look at it. But I think, I mean, I'm sort of being a little blasé about it. But yeah, I do actually think that it is an art. But we can probably get onto that a bit later.
Yeah.
So while I'm not writing books right now, the reason I got into journalism is a combination of I love writing, I love reading, and I'm curious as hell. I'm just very inquisitive and nosy, I should say, and like poking my nose into other people's business and finding out things. And I seem to have a little bit of a knack for, because I like people, I like the interaction and relating to people, and lo and behold, sometimes they open up and tell me things. And so I find those things interesting, and when I piece them together, sometimes, you come up with a really interesting story. And now, over the years, I've come to marry up those instincts and predilections with a true belief and understanding that journalism is and can be in the public service. It's a mission. And now more than ever, it is important. I don't mean it to sound corny or maudlin, but it really is. It is something that I feel is more needed now than ever. Is important. We as journalists at the Washington Post, and I'm sure at the other outlets, are getting unsolicited, emails, calls, signal messages, reach outs from people who are eager to share what they know because they are so concerned about what's going on in the world and in our government. People who would probably never, many of whom have never actually ever spoken to a reporter before. So that is the moment we are living in, and what I am trying to capture and explore and be responsible to the public for.
So I retired in 2019, and it was a big shift. I've lived my life undercover, dealing with really interesting things, if you would. And I suppose I had some angst going through the process. So my youngest daughter, who's a teenager then, she's an engineer now, and that might tell you about the way she looks at problems, just sat me down and said, Dad, I understand why you feel this way. Life as you know it is over. And that was her way of giving me a pep talk to say, you're not going to be a spy anymore, but think about what you can do with what you have collected in your knowledge. So I started writing, and I told you, Andrew, first I thought I'd write a novel to just kind of work out the feelings and relationships, and then I found myself writing anecdotes, and that's how it turned into a nonfiction work.
To some extent, Doug, was it cathartic for you, or was it a way to put a bow on a long career in the CIA?
Yeah and no, because it's only so cathartic because you can only spew so much. There's like limitations, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But yeah, it was a way at least of getting the feelings and the sentiments. And as I tell you when I preach, and I one of my former students out there, the world of espionage is people, and it's relationships, and it's kind of understanding souls. So yeah, in that degree, it was very cathartic getting that out there.
Mm-hmm. I see you nodding your head there, Ellen. Can you elaborate on the human part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I occasionally do speak to classes and foreign service officers, mid-career government employees, and often remark on how similar, in a way, what it is we as journalists do to what intelligence officers, spies do, in terms of trying to, a lot of what we do depends on building relationships, developing relationships of trust with people who are in a position to, share insights and information about things that otherwise are very hard to get at, that are secret. This can be inside the government, outside the government, in other countries, in places outside government, inside government, in other countries, and while a lot of what we do too is dependent on how we on documents. It's great to get actual hard copies of documents that tell you what might be going on. You need to have a human being who understands what that document says and what was written to help put it into context. Otherwise, if you just say report on something that someone handed you that might be a piece of classified information, for instance, or it looks like it says top secret and SCI, but it might not be, in fact, everything might not be authentic, or it might not be in total context. So developing those relationships, human relationships over the years, trying to figure out and vet who is reliable, credible, someone who will tell you what they know when they don't know what the extent of their lack of knowledge is, or so they can be honest with you. That's very important in the tradecraft, I think, of journalism, and which is similar to what you do in the intelligence community.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to know what your process was. So I always enjoy it in the Sunday newspapers when you can go to the back cover and it's some novelist and they tell you that they write in their a shack in their backyard or something, and they've got all of these like weird things that they have to do, or a process. What's it like for each of you? Can you write anywhere? Do you have certain place and time you have to do it, or just help the people here understand how you go about doing your writing?
I think a psychiatrist could write a dissertation on how I approach this question. So I'm very restless. I go from place to place. I can't stay still for too long. But the thing I need at the same time is no distractions. So it's kind of a push-pull. I tend, so in when I was younger, I wrote at night. But now I find in my 7th decade that I'm much fresher in the morning. So basically I sit down and write in the morning. How much do I prepare? Probably not enough. I have a gut feeling of where something ought to go, and then I do it, and then I think about it, and then I revise and revise and revise.
Yeah, I don't, my process, such as it is really just sit down at the computer and start cranking it out. I tend to do it in my study at home, but that's a luxury I now have that I didn't used to have. But in the ye olde days, it was more, moving from library to library, carrel to carrel, room to room. But I can kind of write anywhere if I really need to. I can write on a plane. So that's essentially it. I mean, I don't really have any routines or anything like that. I'm prone to distractions. So it tend to listen to music, but I too have a kind of this weird morbid curiosity in how others are doing it and how they're invariably doing it better than I am. So it is a strange interest. But yeah, there's no real secret to it. I think it's really, and again, I used to write at night, to 2, 3 in the morning, but that was fueled by, sort of nicotine and caffeine, and I can't do that anymore. So yeah, nowadays I tend to write in the mornings, do a couple of hours, knock off, do it again, try and fit it in wherever you can when that kind of thing. So yeah.
I'm just curious, do you keep your phone beside you? Or do you keep it on? Do you turn the notifications off? It's not a trick question, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I tend to keep it nearby, because, just for the music, of course. I tend after a while you have to just shut down email and all that and notifications and all that kind of thing. Otherwise you're just kind of spinning your wheels, you're wasting your time. So yeah, once you get going and you get into a flow, time moves very quickly, I think.
Ellen, process.
Well, as a reporter, time has different rhythms these days. Especially, there are, we're writing constantly, and I started 30 plus years ago. So back in the day when you could go to the newsroom, write up a story, leave at 5 o'clock, go to the bar with your friends, and you're done with your story. You're done with your editor, and the paper gets delivered in the morning, and then wake up and you go back to work the next day. Today, you're expected to, you can file at 10 o'clock at night. You may have to do an update if someone tweets out something or puts it up on Truth Social at midnight, 1 o'clock. We have, editors around the world in Seoul and London who pick up the news and keep it going 24 hours. So I long for the romantic notion of sitting back there with your coffee and your cigarettes and just writing. Right. Well, but that's not my pace these days, unfortunately.
Thanks. So as a case officer, as a spy, your whole world is multitasking. I mean, you're doing so many different things. You're thinking about an upcoming agent meeting, a past agent meeting, casing a site for something in the future, doing whatever other diabolical scheme you might have in mind. So it's really like more that intersection of idea and opportunity. When I write, even today, whether it's a book or an article or something like that, and my phone's on, and I'll take calls, particularly from my kids or whatever like that, which and they do call and they talk for long periods of time. So I guess I shouldn't complain. So I don't have a particular process, but like Ellen, I would love to see myself with the sifter of brandy and the fire and such like that, but I'm still waiting for that to happen.
Okay. I was kind of hoping these were all going to be more neurotic so that we could get more. How do you keep the process moving along? Like, do you have like a daily word limit or a daily page limit? I'm thinking of, I think it was Anthony Burgess, the author of A Clockwork Orange. He had the Martini method. So he was a functional alcoholic, and he couldn't have his first drink of the day until he had written 1,000 words. So he would tie himself to his chair, and he couldn't get up for any reason until he had the 1,000 words. And of course, as a alcoholic, he really wanted his first drink of the day. So I'm assuming it's not quite as extreme is that for you, Nick? But do you have a way of moving along?
Yeah, if I were driven by alcohol, I probably wouldn't discuss it here. But I'm a creature of deadlines. So give me a deadline and I'll do it. If I don't have a deadline, it's kind of like, well, you're writing this sort of on spec. You hope somebody will take it. You hope it'll be published somewhere. I'm not as driven. But if I know by next Tuesday it has to be done, it will be done, and I'll even write in the afternoon, for God's sake.
Yeah, I don't use any kind of word count or page count or anything like that. I see these things in Scrivener and other apps and so on. I don't really understand how it works, because you could set yourself an arbitrary word count of 1,000 words a day or 1,200, and you're just gonna be writing to that limit. Some days you get 100 words, some days you get, up to 6,000. I mean, you can do it. Paul Johnson, the historian in England, used to claim he did 6,000 words a day. I've done 6,000 words in a day, and you can't do it every day. It's impossible. I tend to average about 1,500. But again, it really depends on time and what the subject you're writing about. If you need to check a lot of footnotes, you're obviously going to do a lot less. And if you don't have to check, or it's like an easy section, you can just roll it through. But yeah, and it's like there are some people like Trollope, the great Trollope, who in his autobiography he says that he was also a postal inspector, I think, in Ireland, so he had a day job. Again, if you have a day job, then yes, you're going to be much more regulated. He used to, I think, get up at 6 in the morning, and he would write, I think it's either 250 or 500 words, and it was to the nose. I mean, he would just stop in the middle of a sentence if he reached word 500, and he'd put his pen down, go have breakfast, and go ride around Ireland. But again, that takes he used to turn out these, 3 books a year or something doing that method. So, there are pluses to it, I guess. But I think the more important thing is just consistency. It's routine. You got to do it every day. And, you do that for 365 days a year, then you're going to be writing quite a lot of material, which will, of course, all be deleted and edited because most of it's rubbish.
And did either of you have...
So, as a reporter and at the Washington Post, it's not a 9-to-5 job. I don't have a quota of stories. There have been periods over my 30-year career at the Post where maybe I did one story a week. When I was working with David Marinis, I think we worked for 2 years on this project on Al Gore, and so there would be months without a story. But these days, it's maybe a story a day, and then a quick two-paragraph item that goes up quickly on the website just to update people on the latest news out of USAID or the Treasury and Doge. So it just varies. And at the same time as I'm doing these daily stories and 2-paragraph updates, I'm also working on longer-term pieces that could take weeks or months. And I don't measure those so much in word counts as inches, and it varies from maybe 50 to anything over 100 the editor wants to slash.
Okay.
So it might sound a lot like my last answer, but I guess I write with a sense of urgency. I always think I'm rushed even when I'm not, because I'm used to getting something and having to write it up in the middle of the night and send it in. So a little bit maybe like Ellen, I'll be writing different things at the same time. I might be writing an op-ed and then working on a book or a longer piece, and then I write it really quick and I write a lot, and then I go, I actually have time. So, I go back and I try to tweak it. So I don't have a real great, I wish I did, but yeah.
And I think it would be interesting to explore the content a bit more now. So intelligence. What are some of the challenges of writing about intelligence specifically? So it'll be different for each one of you, but let's start with you, Doug. As a former intelligence officer, what were the difficulties for you?
So the agency is upfront about a couple of its approaches to a couple of different issues. One is marrying a foreign national, which I didn't. They tell you we make it as hard as we possibly can to discourage you from doing it. And likewise, writing about the agency. They are a little more sanguine about how outspoken they are about that. But I have to submit everything I write to the agency's, it's now called the Publications Classified Review Board, which is a story in itself, how that name has changed. And even stuff I present publicly. So if it's written, my students for my classes, I teach at Georgetown, and I'm going to teach at SAIS this summer. I've got to run written things by them for their approval, which is technically focused on removing anything that's classified. But what's interesting about the title of the office, which didn't exist when I joined the agency in the 80s. I think really there was a top form of it in the 90s, and then it really established after 9/11. Their job, and they tell you, we're just going to review your products to remove classified information. But it doesn't always feel that way. And some folks challenged it actually with the oversight committees. And it turned out that the agency might have been redacting things that they felt were embarrassing or they were a little uncomfortable with. And the oversight committees reminded them that's not the letter of the law. And they actually changed their name from the Publication Review Board to the Publication Classified Review Board to emphasize that their focus was on classified information. Mm-hmm. Supposed to be.
And Ellen?
Yeah, so as a reporter covering national security and intelligence, obviously one of the foundational challenges is getting access to information that is often classified, and then making sure that the information is accurate and in context. Now, you just alluded to an issue, though, Doug, that I think is something that is well known, and I think many top intelligence officials would agree. There is overclassification of information in the intelligence community, so that, for instance, there are things you've written that probably didn't need to be redacted or classified or kept secret, but were because maybe they seemed embarrassing or would undermine relations with a foreign country or something. So those are some of the two of the issues I deal with just out of the gate as a reporter covering national security, and another one would be ensuring that my sources, who I've developed relationships of trust with over the years, are people I can protect and who will not receive any discipline or be reprimanded in any way for speaking to a reporter, and often not because they're divulging anything per se classified, but because they're just trying to help me understand the context, the equities, the policy issues sometimes that surround the information that I may have gotten elsewhere. And you're constantly juggling all of these things, and you've also got in your head I get told things all the time. Not all of them are newsworthy. So I have to gauge how relevant, how important to the public interest is this. What are the motives of the person sharing this information with me? All the sorts of things you as intelligence officers also, consider. And you're constantly, weighing those as you report and figure out where you go with this information and what you should write. I, was one of the, maybe a dozen reporters on a team working on the Snowden documents that got released to, in part, the Washington Post, among other outlets. And with those documents, I want to say we took our job and our role seriously as national security reporters to also ensure that we weren't just willy-nilly putting out information irresponsibly that could harm national security. In fact, we've published maybe only an infinitesimal fraction of the material that we actually got hold of, and not before vetting it for accuracy and for context, and offering the agency involved, often the NSA, but also we went to CIA, ODNI, we were dealing with all of these agencies, and offering them the chance to push back, to comment, to let us know their concerns with us publishing stories involving that information. It wasn't, an entire, no side was entirely pleased with what happened, but I think in the end we achieved a fair equitable balance of measuring public interest versus national security, and doing so with the public interest in mind of what transparency, disclosure, but ensuring that we weren't unduly harming national security. So,
and just to be clear for everyone here, Imagine Doug is still in the CIA, and you approach him. Is it like completely? Is that something that's really not meant to happen? Like, you're not meant to speak to her, she's not meant to speak to you. You have to report it. Because there's a bit of a grey area here, right?
There's no grey area. It's very clear.
I mean for Ellen, not for you.
Well, no, for Ellen, that is based on the courts and journalistic integrity, I suppose.
Yeah.
But as an officer of the CIA or any intelligence officer, you can't have any contact with a journalist, obviously. And if I'm undercover, it'd be pretty bad if they did know I was CIA and talking to me. And in fact, much of what we do, because of the sensitivities of our cover, and that's largely our cover, and the people it affects, we have to, like, for example, if Ellen and I both had kids going to the same school, and Ellen, and I know Ellen's a journalist, and Ellen's like, our kids are playing together, let's have them over, let's have a dinner, I would have to get permission from the CIA to do that and say, she's a journalist, she's invited me, I'm not going to talk about my job, I'm going to use my cover, whatever that cover is supposed to be, and all will be well. And, 50-50 that the agency would say yay or nay. And, I understand, from both perspectives very well. And I talk to journalists all the time now. I never did until I got out, except by accident when they were talking to me and I was in my cover capacity. But I understand it, but at the same point, even I'm a willing critic of the CIA, and I'd like to think in a healthy way to try to get them to do things better and be the organization that they should always be. But I'm really uncomfortable about classified information, and I get, right now I'm getting all sorts of calls from journalists who are like all of a sudden my best friends, and I'm like, I'm just not at liberty to talk to you about that. Right?
Mm-hmm. I feel like this could be a fascinating separate panel some other time. What have the difficulties been for you, Alexander, writing about intelligence?
Well, I'm in a very fortunately, I'm in a very different boat from my colleagues here in that all of my subjects are long dead. So I have never filed a Freedom of Information Act request. I don't know how to do that. I'm sure it's quite simple, but I completely at sea with it. Mostly because I tend to do old stuff, old, historical intelligence stuff. I'm very comfortable in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. I've just written a World War II book, which is coming out soon. But I mean, that's about as late as I go. And, that was just an experiment. So it's very useful for me in a sense in that you can't libel the dead, so which is always helpful. But the most important thing for me is that is actually just not requesting the documents, access to them, but they're all on open access essentially. It's just trying to find these things and making sense of them and reading them and putting them into chronological order and sorting them out and getting copies of them for further perusal. So that's my difficulty, but it's a field I enjoy. So that's essentially it.
So my answer is very simple and similar. I like to stay to events that occurred before January 1946. I remember the old, so it was the PRB, and the old PRB used to say, if it touches on intelligence in any way, you need to send it in. And so the first book that I did after I retired was about Ernest Hemingway, and the main event was the Spanish Civil War. The PRB read it 3 times, and I had a friendly enough conversation, according to third parties who the feedback loop came back to me, and I thought I had to be scraped off the ceiling, and they said, no, the word is that you were very polite. But it was that we have to treat everything the same, no matter when the period was, if it touches on intelligence. And I think now they've tightened it up so that it's really, I mean, there was nothing that Hitler was going to learn from my book that he didn't already know. But I think now it's more it's been tightened up and it's more oriented to classified, which is a good way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Just quickly, Nick, you were in the CIA, then you were a CIA historian, now you're not in the CIA, you're a historian. Help us understand the different iterations of Nick Reynolds.
I was the museum historian at CIA. So we were history with a little h. That my colleague David Robarge here ran the main shop. So before that, I was a field historian for the Marine Corps for a while, and I wrote official history for the Marine Corps, and so I've written various kinds of history, and thinking back on this, my mindset has changed over time. When I was an official historian for the Marine Corps, I was really a pretty good boy. I was very careful to describe exactly what happened, to document my sources. And I almost never said, this really shows that General Banats was totally incompetent. I never did that. And I had Army colleagues who also did military history, official history, and they could be brutal. They would and did, in official publications, come to that conclusion. This really shows that this general didn't know what he was doing. So over time, I've gotten I've gotten freer with my judgments. Let me put it that way. I think if you're writing, so I wrote history for the CIA Museum. So you're not going to write a barn burner that's going to go on the wall in the museum that says, well, this shows that this operation was just a total failure. So you're gonna find some. It's going to say something like, this operation faced certain challenges that and now I think I'm a little freer and I like working for myself. You don't get paid a lot, but I can, if I think something was really wrong, I can express my judgment, and I like being able to do that.
Mm-hmm. And a question for Nick and Alexander. Since you've both written a few books now, can you help anyone in the audience who's written one and about to write their second? How did you deal with what's been called the difficult second album syndrome? So, Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction, massive hit. Then it comes up with a flop, but then you get other bands who their second album is even better, like Coldplay or Radiohead. How can you help everyone in the audience be Coldplay or Radiohead and not Guns N' Roses?
I think that's the best question I've had in a few years, and really food for thought. So if you're writing official history, or you're writing a series of articles, or you're following your research loves, that's different. So my Hemingway book was commercially successful, and then there's pressure on you. Hey, we didn't sign you to write one book, is kind of what the publishing industry says. And so I just scurried all around trying to well, what about this? What about that? And I think my answer would be, take it easy. Don't. It's really got to come from you and not from outside. I've got to toss this James Joyce story in here somewhere. It's kind of relevant. So James was facing a writer's block at a certain point in his career, and just nothing. And so Nora says, well, just sit at your desk and something will come. And at the end of the day, he says, Nora, I have 7 words today. And she says, that's great, James. And James says, yes, but in what order?
Well, my first book was such a catastrophe that, which is a book very few here probably have heard of, because it's called Kings in the North, and it's called The House of Percy in British History, 1066 to 1485. So exciting stuff, which was, the publisher came to me and said, hey, let's contract for 100,000 words. And so I submitted 180,000 words 4 years later. And so we compromised at about 240,000 words about a year and a half after that. So I was very much looking forward to my second book. I had no second album things. I mean, you could probably say, just to play that same game, that my first book was my Chinese democracy album. And the got some gags there. The second one was Washington Spies, where I basically used all of the lessons I'd learned about how not to write a book and applied it to that. And but even then, looking back on Washington Spies, I'd say now it's probably over detailed. It's a little over plotty. Nowadays, I think also because attention spans have been declining, you have to write faster, slicker, shorter books. As time goes on, you tend to, you evolve your style of writing as well. So I think, so I didn't really have a second album problem. I had a first album problem.
And just out of interest, how did you come across the story of the Culper spy ring? Because, that book became hugely popular, became the basis of a TV show that was hugely popular. Was that serendipity, or just help us understand how you came to write Washington Spy specifically?
Well, all good book ideas are serendipitous. You can't plan them. I would advise, just to quickly, never write a book at the suggestion of a publisher or anybody. That's how I got into the trouble with the first one, where the publisher said, hey, we need some idiot to write some book about the House of Percy. Get this idiot to do it. So I said, again, yeah, sure, I'll do it. It'll take a year, no problem. So you always use your own ideas, mostly because you don't really know what the publisher, or the editor or the agent is sort of vaguely thinking in his or her mind. And so you tend to overwrite and overplan and so on. That's how you get yourself into a lot of problems. But as for Washington Spies, casting my mind back, it was quite a while ago now, and I was a younger and sprightlier man. And I think it came across, I happened to be reading the memoirs of Kim Philby, what's it called? My Silent War, which is, it's an interesting book. I mean, it's a pack of lies, but it's an interesting book. And I think I was also reading something about Benedict Arnold or something. And I was thinking, it'd be really cool to do like a pro-Benedict Arnold book. Yeah, let's just take that opposite way. And
take it easy, everyone. Take it easy.
And that'd be cool. Tell it from his perspective. And and I think I just married the two, and then I began thinking, well, what about spying during the American Revolution? Were there any sort of Kim Philby types during the American Revolution? I had no idea. So I went, and then I thought, well, it'd be really cool, maybe like George Washington, because that would sell some numbers. And so I remember I was living in Washington at the time. I went to Georgetown University Library, and there was something called a card catalog that some people may not be familiar with. And I was looking through, basically, spying during the Revolution, espionage during the Revolution, intelligence spy, all that kind of stuff. And I wasn't George Washington and spying, and there was nothing coming up at all. And I think the last academic article about revolutionary ciphers had come out in 1917 or something like that. It was just basically this completely dead field, mostly because it was so obvious. I think everyone just else assumed that it must have been done, so why would I bother looking into this? And that's how it came across, and that's how, and then I sort of put it together. And then at the time, it was still sort of George Washington, and I was going to do I could do 1,000 pages on espionage during the Revolution, because everybody would want to read that. And then I came across the Culper ring, and I began linking, you've got to tell the story through characters. And so happenstance, in the George Washington papers at the Library of Congress, which I think had only recently been digitized, there were, if you looked very carefully and you did searches, and you could find a couple of hundred letters from these guys, and that's when, and you realize, you could, if you put these things, it was all mixed up everywhere, and if you just put them together in strict chronological order, read them through, you would have the biography of George Washington's private spy ring. So that was basically how it came about.
Wow. And for Ellen and Doug, is there a book that you're working on now, or something that you would aspire to do in the future, or maybe it's even a retirement dream, or help us understand where you are now with writing and books.
So I've written another book, which is in draft, and it's working its way through the organization, and they've been kinder in some places than others. In my case, I mean, the ideas were just every day you read the newspapers, and the ideas to me were there. It's essentially on the weaponization of intelligence, right? So my first book was more my cathartic, working out of my angst, 40 years in the ghetto kind of thing, and this one tries to be particularly less critical of the agency and what have you, and really kind of look at what I think people should be more aware of going on in the shadows, that other war that is going on out there, that with the age of technology and disinformation and deep fakes and cyber hacking, I mean, that's war, right? It's hybrid warfare anyway, and there are casualties. So that kind of inspired me, and I try to do the same process where I sort of wove in anecdotes of agents I had recruited and how some of those operations would be very different today, if at all, and how some of those operations really were going for the same goals. We're weaponizing secrets, weaponizing capabilities that were deniable, but that could, at least in our case, serve national interests, or in our case, hurt us in terms of when the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians are doing it.
Okay. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for audience questions, so I'm just going to ask one more question of each of you before we open it up to all of you. And that's if there was one piece of advice that you would give to anyone in the audience that wants to write a book, what would it be?
That's a tough one. So I like what I just heard here on my right about. There's basically two ways to go to a subject, and one would be to have a vision. So this is really about you're looking for Benedict Arnold Phil B. Arnold. You're looking for that pattern, and the other way to do it is to immerse yourself in a subject and then see what comes out. So you come at it from a different end. So I think that would be a useful insight for a historian or a writer. And the other thing I would say was don't give up.
Well, I can only speak to the trade industry, trade business, rather than the academic presses and so on. If you want to write that kind of book, my advice would be, think only in terms of story and characters. Link all events to personalities. Readers want to know about characters, how they overcome challenges, what they do, clashes, conflicts, all that kind of thing. Make it dramatic, and also I tended to have this because I did a PhD many years ago, and so when I was first writing, I think, and you see evidence of this in Washington Spies before I began shaking it off a bit, and that is, there's a tendency to put in everything that's really, really interesting. And so I don't think in Washington Spies, in hindsight, I probably didn't need to have sort of 4 pages on Quakerism in the mid-18th century. Very interesting, but the fact is that you need to, like Voltaire in his now forgotten biography of Charles XII of Sweden, you need to just be ruthless about getting rid of extraneous stuff. It's all very interesting, but it leads into digressions. It leads into long chapters. You're just going off the subject. So you need to pare back all the interesting stuff in favor of course, what's important. And then Rose's rule, number 132, is that if you're going to keep the important stuff, for God's sake, make it interesting. and link it to the story. Just keep the story moving forward. I think there's a tendency in academic writing to indulge in theory, and in the trade press, theory is death. Nobody wants to read it. Stick it in a footnote like Gibbon or someone like that. And various other debates with one has with other historians who are, of course, wrong. So that's basically what I'd say. Just focus on and keeping it short, especially nowadays. Think in terms of scenes in your chapters. Divide things up into sections. And in my first book, I think I had like 40-page chapters, and this was perfect because who isn't a 19th century gentleman being able to just read by the fire for 6 hours at a time? Nowadays, it's just section, build up the chapter, move it on into an act, and so forth.
And if people were to go and read, say, buy your past 3 books, they would see all of that in there as almost like a template. I think my third, I tend to forget the order of them. The third to last was Empires of the Skies, which is, again, nothing to do with intelligence. It was just about I thought it was very interesting that the epic race between Zeppelins and airplanes from about 1900 to 1940, which is completely forgotten about nowadays because of the dominance of the airplane. So that's a bit of a, again, that's in sections. I think where I kind of hit it was in The Lion and the Fox, where you suddenly see focus on you see this also in Empires of the Skies, but it's a much longer book. Keep things short, keep things tight. 2 characters, interweave, fighting with each other, and then explain all of the interesting contextual stuff in history that you need to talk about, like, I don't know, ciphers during the Civil War. Meld that in, blend it in with what a character is doing. But for my latest book, Phantom Fleet, which I think you mentioned before, which is coming out on May 20th, which I just have to mention in here. Of course. The editor will be very annoyed if I don't. That's the World War II book. That is about a hunt for a Nazi U-boat. And again, I think taking different perspectives. I think I sort of enhanced it there. Taking different perspectives. You have the American guys, and you have the German U-boat skipper, and what's going on with Dönitz and the U-boat command and so forth. So I think so I'm getting better at it. I think. The audience will be the judge of that, I think. Thanks.
Alex, if I could just steal your moderator's privilege for 1 minute, I want to point out a colleague and another mentor of mine who's here in the audience who really should be up here on the stage and is a phenomenal journalist who's turned into a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. It's David Hoffman right there in the second row, written The Oligarchs, The $1 Billion Spy, The Dead Hand. Fantastic. So I'm sure you've all read them. David, in fact, if someone wants to hand you the mic, you could probably share a couple of tips about writing for, about espionage and spies, just riveting stuff that you do.
This isn't fair because I was Ellen's editor when she was a foreign correspondent of the paper, and I was the foreign editor, and she and Ellen were out there on the cutting edge of discovering the truth for the Washington Post, and now she's getting back at me. I agree about writing in scenes. I agree about writing in mornings. I agree about following your own ideas. And I think I've had a book or two project fall apart. It turned out you have to be willing to fail.
Mm-hmm. Be willing to fail. And Doug?
Yeah, I'm really ill-suited to offer any advice. I'm a teacher at Georgetown, but I'm a practitioner, which I found to understand actually has the practical equivalent in money, really, which is why I'm a practitioner. But I write what I know, essentially, and things I've personally experienced, and I try to tell the story of that. So I don't have the guidance, and certainly Mr. Hoffman, who I'd like to think I've contributed a little bit to your assets, because I use $1 Billion Spy in every class I teach on Tolkachev, and speak with him of great sentiment and such. But I don't think I have much beyond that to offer.
Okay, thanks. Let's open it up to all of you for any questions you may have. Ma'am?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, is it possible to go over to the microphone, ma'am? Just over there.
Thank you so much to the panel. My question is, how do you make the strategic choice of writing nonfiction, which sometimes forces you to have to go through agencies, review, or contend with controversy, versus fictionalizing the story?
I think Doug might also have some ideas. So if you're a retired CIA employee and you write the same story as fiction, you're still going to have to send it to the PCRB. And the other observation I'd have would be, I tried to write a novel, I sent it to the same publisher, they shook their heads and they said, you know, the world pretty much divides into people who can do fiction and people who can do nonfiction. And Nick, stay with nonfiction.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say here. I mean, I'm an independent, so I don't have to run work past any official body. I mean, apart from my editor, who will ask a few impertinent questions, which then get ignored. So yeah, I'm probably not the best person to ask that.
Yeah, I think I suck as a novelist, basically, is my answer. I write, my characters are real people. And to protect them, because these are agents or people who are undercover, I have to be limited in how I describe them, which probably compensates for my sucky novelist skills in not being able to tell you exactly what this person looks like and where they were and such like that. So I try to write, like you, Nick, I try to write novels, and I had very much the same reaction from my publisher and agent, so yeah.
And Jeff, are you?
Yes, thank you. Nick, you were instrumental when I started writing my book and my dissertation. You shared sources with me, very willingly. I was relating the story last night. I was doing OSS research, Second World War, and you were writing Need to Know at the time. And I was looking at the OSS archives, and you told me Bureau of Budget. And it ended up being a gold mine, because they were bean counters, and they were really, after the OSS. So peer review and having support is important. Can you all talk about who supported you, your peer review process, where you get inspiration from, literally, interpersonally? Because I think one of the reasons for this panel and for the audience is a lot of us are very collegial and we share sources, we read each other's work, but any more insights that you can offer, we'd appreciate.
Good question.
So thanks, Jeff. Yes, is my answer. Without colleagues and friends that you can turn to, Jeff has been on the receiving end of emails from me, and I'm going, oh my God, Jeff, am I reading this right? Could this guy possibly be saying what I think he's saying? It was a critique of something I'd written, and I read it 3 or 4 times and shook my head, and Jeff came back and said, yep, it says what you think it says. So that's kind of both intellectual and emotional support. It's very hard to do the who was the guy in the little cabin who wrote the manifesto? He was Kaczynski. There are people out there who do that, but I think it's a lot healthier if you are in touch with your peers and you're getting feedback and you're getting support and sharing sources to the extent that you can. Would I turn my whole archive over to somebody and say, well, take what you want? Probably not, but if we overlap but don't, if we overlap partially but don't overlap completely, I'm happy to share.
Yeah, I'm like Nick. I mean, you do read in certain books in the acknowledgements pages, which is what everyone reads first, of course, if you're in that line of work. You always say, you used to read these people like, thanks to. Usually it's the posher the better. They like to, Lord Adelbert, thank you so much for reading, Sir Edward Wilde for reading my manuscript. I've never done that. I would never send out a manuscript to anybody to have them read it. I would, however, and I can testify to this with Nick, when I was writing Phantom Fleet, I wrote to Nick and said, hey, can you help me out with this Admiralty? It was something about some papers in the Admiralty, with which I wasn't familiar, and I think it was based on Need to Know, and you shared your stuff with me, you pointed me in the right direction, so I ordered up the papers, got them, and so on. It's very, very useful. But again, you've noticed that I have not actually sent the manuscript to Nick for a read-through, possibly because he might be horrified by what I've written and done with his with his tips. But yeah, I think it's very important to be collegial in the sense. So if anyone wrote to me and said, and people do, like, where did you get this from? Can you what do you have on this and all this? I tend to just share it. I mean, it doesn't really belong to me. I just have a colossal database that I keep, so I can easily just send out everything to anybody. So if anyone really wants something, send me an email.
So in tradecraft in sort of newsrooms is that, especially on short-term daily stories, it's not like an academic journal where you have peer review and you send it out to, you certainly don't send it to your competition or the New York Times or Wall Street Journal and say, hey, read this, what do you think? But we do, have other reporters, colleagues, often because there are 3 or 4 bylines on a story. So everyone reads, you have to share the draft and make sure people read it and are good with it, and editors can read in on slightly longer time turnaround stories. I've had David, read some draft of, for instance, a story about the NSA and its untold role in the hunt for Osama bin Laden, just to give some feedback on how he thought the story flowed. But he's in-house. I do, while I don't share an entire manuscript or send it to sources, people outside the Washington Post, I will read back to them maybe their quote or a piece of information I got for them to ensure accuracy, to ensure that I got them in context, that I didn't inadvertently misunderstand something they told me, and I've caught many an error that way. And so I feel that's sort of just good due diligence, and colleagues do that as well. In terms of sharing sources, we're fairly collegial at the Washington Post. There are a subset of sources who I think prefer that I keep them very confidential. They wouldn't want anyone, including other reporters, know that they're talking to a reporter, so I wouldn't share their information unless they gave me permission. And there are others who are much more sort of public figures, and it's just good collegiality to share, and they wouldn't mind if colleagues have their contact information or their email addresses. So I think that's pretty much the standard tradecraft there.
So for me, again, I run into the practical problem, that pesky PCRB thing. So I can't show something to someone unless the CIA has already reviewed it. And Jeff knows this firsthand, because we try to collaborate on a piece which I thought was brilliant, Jeff, on transparency and all that kind of good stuff. And we divided up, okay, you'll approach this, you'll approach that, and I had to write my piece, send it to the agency, send it to Jeff. Jeff would send me his stuff. If I thought, oh, good idea, and I can say this, but wait a second, and I have to go back to the agency and go back. So it's a practical problem. On the other hand, I get novels from former colleagues and folks like that who are like, is this accurate? Can I write this? Can I say this? And some folks who were in the IC, but they weren't case officers, so they're interested in some feedback from me on spying and stuff like that. Does that make sense? Would a spy think this, feel this, whatever? So I do that, but my collaborative opportunities are restricted.
Right. And just out of interest, since you've mentioned the Publications Review Board, how different would your book have been if you had just written exactly what you wanted? Like, as percentage term, would it have been 95, or it was like 60, or help us understand the difference between what you submitted and what came out
So
on
it's
the other
being
side.
taped, right?
Yeah.
Taped, yeah. So first of all, I think the PCRB does a great job.
Yeah, right, okay.
Fabulous folks, God knows. I love you all. So yeah, my first book, I didn't know as much about what to expect from them, and I just had entire chapters redacted. And then we tried to negotiate back and forth, and I found that I actually could negotiate somewhat with them back and forth a little bit. Ellen hit on something that I guess I can validate. So in my current book, there's a chapter I have called The Phantom, right? And it started off at actually a piece for a documentary. It was going to interview some former CIA officers and, you know, a couple of war stories. And then I picked this one because I needed to give them real characters and real people. And this was an operation that took place after 9/11, and it was really successful. I recruited an agent who helped us to take down two very important al-Qaeda terrorists. One, Ali Khalfan Gilani, who's the first al-Qaeda guy actually tried in a U.S. court, and he was sentenced and went to jail, and Mohammed Khan, who was, we knew him as Abu Talha. And I was trying to relate it as best I could to protect sources and methods, particularly the agent operational part, but it involved dealing with a foreign government, which eventually they let me say Pakistan. And the Pakistani government, we not always the best of friends, even after 9/11. And this one fellow Abu Talha was a Pakistani. So we had some indications about this person's existence, that they were involved in some pretty important stuff, but he was Pakistani, and the Pakistanis didn't want to touch it. So when I wrote on it, there was a lot of back and forth because I didn't write anything classified because eventually these guys were both arrested. Their stories are out there in the press. Abu Talha was working on the London Heathrow plot, on the Wall Street plot, so it felt kind of good to see him, at least temporarily, go away. But the agency felt by writing about this, particularly I was there at the time, would upset the Pakistanis, which would then upset our relations. And because I was former agency officer, that made it classified. And that was their read on it. So it went back and forth because they saw at the end, it was a story that made the agency look good. We saved lives, we stopped terrorist activities, bad guys went away, all that kind of stuff. So there was negotiation. But yeah, I mean, there's a sweet spot between what I would like to write and what I still think's unclassed because, you know, I spent the first third of my career, I guess, under deeper cover. But then towards the later third, I was dealing with a lot of foreign governments. So I was always dealing with protecting sources and methods, engaging. So I kind of knew what my boundaries were, but sometimes it's a little bit beyond that. And I want to have a good relationship with the PCRB and the agency, if you're out there. So I would rather find a way to negotiate it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The argument that, oh, if you disclose this piece of information, it will really disrupt relationships, oh, they'll shut down this base, or, you know, we'll lose their cooperation is one that we have heard in the past at the Washington Post, and it's case dependent. There was one story my colleagues worked on, not me in particular, but involved like a secret CIA drone base was in Saudi, and the argument was, if you divulge this, then we'll lose their cooperation, and Al Qaeda, AQAP will, kill people. So I think the Post agreed to sort of hold off, and then some smaller outlet got wind of the same story because it was out there and wrote it, and so in the end, nothing happened. I mean, the cooperation continued, but that was one example of where, sometimes you just have to, as a journalist, a news organization, make your own judgments about the arguments you're hearing. The other point I wanted to make was open source intelligence. There's just so much more of it now. It's really changing the way we do our business, our jobs. We have visual forensics reporters, journalists, editors now whose job is to really scour what you can find through satellite imagery and just stuff that's out in the open. And oftentimes it's as powerful as, if not more powerful, than what you can find inside. I think the government, I've heard former agency personnel tell me that because they're out in the private sector now, that what they're getting is sometimes more robust than what they could get on the inside. And I still remember, over 10 years ago now, in the cyber field, cyber used to be very highly classified. I think Mike Hayden once said cyber is the most classified area because it began in one of the deepest, darkest sort of agencies. There is the NSA, which no such agency. So, in other words, that's why everything was so super secret and classified. Well, everyone started to know that we were being hacked by the Chinese and the Russians, but back then, and this would have been 2009, 10, Obama administration, people were still concerned about relations. We thought we could have relations with China and Russia, and they didn't. Diplomats in particular were sensitive about not annoying them by calling them out publicly from the US government. And so even though there were security agencies that wanted to attribute and point the finger to, say, Chinese and Russian state government operations, there were other equities pushing back against that, saying, no, no, no. And so there was a euphemism that came about, Advanced Persistent Threat, APT, which meant state-sponsored cyber operations, because the government itself couldn't say China, but they could say APT. But it was a private sector company, Mandiant, that did an open source report about Chinese hacking of news organizations and others, and publicly attributed the PLA unit that did this. And after that, that sort of broke the dam. The US government and intelligence agencies were able to point back to that study and say, oh yes, you see, China, PLA was doing this kind of hacking. And so in that case, it was the private sector through the open source that led the way and enabled the government to be able to come out and publicly attribute to other governments. Today, the government has no problem publicly pointing to China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, but back then, diplomatic sensitivities, among other things, constrained it.
Any other questions? I have one in the meantime. Is there anything that you want to ask each other?
Nick, how much did you make for your last advance?
I'm curious too.
The question everyone really wants.
I could expand on that a little bit. If you're thinking, if you want to make a living as a writer, most everyone needs to think again. Because even moderately successful writers are going to be shopping at the dollar store if they try and survive on their writing. So there's not a lot of money out there. Let me just put it that way. There is for some people, but and then there's other there's the whole gamut from no advance, almost no payment, to huge advances. But I think most of us are somewhere in the middle or closer to the lower end. So think twice about giving up your day job, but still continue to write.
No, the only thing I would say, particularly for journalists very, very close to me, and fearing that I might burst into flames at any moment, is that it's hard, I think, addressing intelligence in any form, in books and particularly nonfiction, because so much of it is in fact classified. And Ellen speaking to open source, which is fabulous stuff, and spies have been using that for a long time before it became the sexy thing. But that the heart of intelligence is, what people don't know. One of my very senior analytic colleagues, who was a presidential briefer, said, really our job is to talk about the unknown, the uncertain, and the deliberately concealed. And I think that really is what intelligence is about, at least as a spy, and I see a lot of head shaking, because we look for lessons in history and patterns and precedent, and we try to project the future, though the IC does not crystal balls, I remind my students, but it comes down to being able to interpret all this data to what was driving those decisions, Washington and Mr. Hemingway, great book, by the way, I loved it, thank you, Nick. And that's what I dealt with in my career, is the person that Ellen said, who can explain what that document meant? Who can explain what the thinking was? And that's, sometimes hidden away in the annals of history, and we can unearth it, and it gives us sort of like an epiphany, like, oh, wow, that's fantastic. But that's what I think you all are doing today as academics, and what I did as a practitioner, as a spy, is, yeah, we know that we could see this on the battlefield, we can see it from imagery. What does it mean, and what does it tell us about the future? Mm-hmm. So I think what you all do is great, and I will continue to try to add my little piece to it.
Thanks. Yes, sir?
Question for Ms. Nakashima. I'll start with an anecdote. When I was young, I was writing an article, and I interviewed an old guy, and he kind of puffed up his role in what had happened. And I was going to put in a footnote, like, he puffed up his role. And the mentor said, are you crazy? He's an old guy telling stories. He probably believes it by now. But for you, what if somebody says to you, I've read the depositions, I've seen the secret evidence, and this is what happened. And then it turns out they lied to you. They broke the trust you had. Do you burn them? Do you use them again? What do you do?
No, I would not use them again if it turns out that they burned the trust, but I also probably wouldn't have just run that piece of information without getting at least a good second source and usually more than two sources, depending on how sensitive the information is. So, rule of thumb for us is we don't just take someone's say-so and put that in the paper. We have to vet it, do the due diligence, get multiple sources for information, especially if it's secret, not publicly known, not easily verifiable. And then over time, you vet your sources, and if someone like that comes up and he gives you something and turns out completely wrong, you don't talk to him again, don't take his call again. But if over time what they're telling you is generally is consistent, is accurate, and to include when they don't know something, sources who want to seem helpful and so will say something because they think it helps you, but they don't really know. That's not being helpful at all. So that's important to know, when if people who can tell you that this is what I don't know, I'll just tell you what I do know, and this is how confident I am of it, and this is maybe how I know it.
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, sorry.
From my perspective, sensationalism is again, it's a very ambiguous word. One can use historical imagination but not as historical invention to just make up stuff. But again, the sensationalization of intelligence work has a very long history. It goes back, I think, basically you start seeing it just after the Civil War with the memoirs of Lafayette Baker, who's the head of the Secret Service, which are essentially made up. And then you see this sort of Victorian romanticization of spies, and it sort of takes off with Erskine Childers and Riddle of the Sands and all this kind of stuff, and it sort of reaches its height in the 20s and 30s. I have maintained a small collection of books dating from the 90s and 20s and 30s about spying during the First World War and all this kind of thing. And essentially these things are just completely, invented. So it comes with the territory. As for doing it yourself, yeah, you need to tame your impulses. Now, again, I can, especially on things like flap copy, the stuff around a dust cover. Yeah, you have to kind of sell the book. It's never a heist of World War II. It's the greatest heist of World War II. That's just a bit of hype. But I think if it starts really infecting the text itself, then you've got a problem. Otherwise, you just get garbage like Wikipedia articles souped up. and exaggerated and turned into essentially novels. So that's my view on it.
And just briefly to paraphrase it, the question was, how do you avoid stepping over the edge of where the evidence can take you to make it a better story, make it more punchy, make it more flashy, sell more copies of your book? Yeah, anybody else got any thoughts on that? Nick?
I have a traditional answer, which is footnotes. So I belong to a couple of writing groups, and I write something in between, a hybrid between academic and commercial. But there's footnotes in my book, and so if you want to see how much I made up, and I'm actually on the really conservative side, so you'll see I hewed pretty closely to the facts. But you can follow my sources. So I think that's a great check. They don't have to be. They can be end notes. They can be blind end notes. So it's it's keyed to a phrase on the page. But I think they ought to be there in a serious book.
So I had this really weird dichotomy, right? Because I'm talking about a business where, there are secrets and people die. But when operations work, it's because they're boring, right? They're not noticed. They're concealed. And no one's ever confused me for any of the actors who've played James Bond or Jason Bourne. So my problem is a little bit of the opposite in translating a very serious business where it's life and death. And sometimes the objectives of an adversary are life and death. And explaining how this really methodical, long-winded, running long surveillance routes so nobody sees me or my asset and the planning, and trying to make that exciting, because that all comes down to, again, for me in espionage, the human relationship. And when you buy multiple copies of my book, The Recruiter, because you'll want to give them to your friends so you can talk about it, it'll become clearer. But so my problem is just the opposite. How do I make the practice of espionage, which if it works, it's boring and nobody ever knows about it, into something that is exciting, because it's the impact that's exciting, as long as nobody gets caught.
And I can attest to Nick's footnoting. He's an anomaly in the sense that he's very eminent and a very, very good human being, which don't always go hand in hand. And he's also a rare example of someone who's an eminent senior historian who footnotes like a graduate student, because everybody knows that, come on, the profs, when you get further up in your career, those footnotes, it's like Jackson Pollock, you just throw them like this. But Nick sticks to the rules. Okay, well, we're out of time. If I can just say, can everyone put their hands together for our panelists, please? Thank you.